So welcome, everyone. I'm always thrilled to see when you're the next to last session or panel of the day to people actually showed up. So thank you. I think this is a fantastic crowd. So we're going to be talking about leveraging artificial intelligence, and I think many of us will just say AI, but leveraging artificial intelligence for learning and success. And, mostly I think we're focused on higher ed, but also, certainly that's happening in K through 12 as well. So I'm going to start by asking you a question. So how many of you use artificial intelligence in your work to support students? Raise them high. Okay, how many of you do you think are using it but don't know that you're using it? Okay, that's probably more correct. So fantastic. So we have an outstanding panel of experts, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to have them introduce themselves. And as they're introducing themselves, I'm going to ask them to, please share your perspective on what artificial intelligence is. And so let's start with Katy.
All right, hi everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Katy Kappler. I am co-founder and CEO of a company called InScribe. So I'll just give you a little background on what we do. We are a virtual support platform that leverages the power of community and artificial intelligence to help connect learners with answers, resources, and the individuals that they need to succeed. So we work primarily with non-traditional students and give them a much more flexible, adaptable, and accessible way to access their peers and the experts across their institution. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what AI means to us at our company. You can imagine when you're building a community platform, one of the most important parts of that platform is the connections that humans are making. And that's very fundamental to the work that we're doing. So we always talk about ourselves as a human-first, technology-enabled solution. So for us, AI is very much about helping to empower the humans in our communities to be able to be more effective in their work. How do we take some of the tasks that when we're really working at scale, when we have thousands and thousands of students participating, the tasks that become impossible for humans to really do and manage, and move those into the technology so the humans can focus on the things that they're really good at, like higher order, collaboration, conversation, and support.
Great, and I've seen InScribe work at home. I have two kids that are ASU online students, so I get to watch InScribe in action, and so I can testify that it actually really does work to help support students 24/7. So Laurie, how about you? What's your perspective?
Hi, everybody. My name is Laurie Forcier. I'm the Chief of Staff and Director of Partnerships at a company called Educate Ventures Research, based in the UK. We are focused on helping all parts of the EdTech ecosystem use data and evidence more wisely for the benefit of their students. In terms of AI, my definition of AI, AI, they're computer systems that have been designed to interact with the world, to exhibit, capabilities and behaviors that we would associate, generally speaking, with being human. Whether that's, in terms of capabilities, visual perception or speech recognition, and in terms of behaviors, taking the next rational step given the data that you have available. But of course, the place where it becomes more powerful is that an artificial intelligence is able to take into account many, many more data points than we could individually as humans, and also drill down to a finer-grained analysis. And those are the really exciting points in how they can, as Katy was saying, supplement and support humans in the higher order thinking they're doing.
Great, George.
I would, define AI as essentially systems, a set of technologies that are able to achieve outcomes without explicitly being able to told that those are the outcomes they need to achieve. When it comes to a learning end, though, I would focus a little bit more on what we've been doing. We just finished a paper on this, but around human and artificial cognition. So my interest is AI writ large is too bulky and too big, but when you take artificial cognition, a technology agent that does some discrete cognitive task, you then are presented with the primary problem that we're grappling, which is how do you integrate the outputs of an artificial cognitive process back into the human knowledge system for effective decision making and activity. So it could be something as simple as a basic search that you integrate back into your knowledge system. How does that influence the social dynamics? Could be something much more complicated, such as a massive system that assesses global stock prices and what the climate change patterns. So I'm really much more interested in that intersection of how do we meaningfully integrate the outputs of these various systems into the other system so that that system changes and what's the effect. In terms of background, I guess I'm involved with University of Texas Arlington and University of South Australia, but we just initiated a group called the Global Research Alliance for AI in Learning and Education, and so we have all the major research labs globally that have been funded around AI and learning on as members, and ASU is one of our charter members that to kick off the organization as well, and we're very interested in how do we integrate AI in a meaningfully functional way, because right now, most of you, if you were to explain exactly what was the effect of an AI deployment in a classroom setting, you would say, I don't know. I mean, maybe you'll have a bit of a clue. Was there a better alternative you could have done with just simply statistical models? Did you need to do something that has AI in it? So we're trying to understand what is the actual practical effect of AI in schools, K-12 through to higher education.
So great. So I'm hearing human-centered community. I'm hearing large data sets and research, and then I'm hearing, building an entire network and then using that data analysis to go back into knowledge systems. So Tomas, tell us what you do at Globant.
Hello everyone. Happy to see you all here. My name is Tomas Tecce. I'm a technical manager at the Data and AI Studio at Globant, based in Buenos Aires, Argentina. So essentially what we do, you all given very, very good, great, comprehensive definitions of AI. So I cannot add really much to that, except maybe from our perspective, as a personal developer of AI solutions and part of a company that integrates AI into pretty much everything that we do. So we're a company that pretty much develops software all across the board for many different applications, not just EdTech. But we have as a kind of institutional, as a center for what we do, is trying to deliver value to our customers and now focusing through AI. So AI for us is a tool, a complex tool, but essentially kind of adding to what George said, I mean, it's not just putting something flashy, a flashy sticker into the things that we develop, but delivering value through AI. And so we try to, as we will probably discuss later in the meeting, we try to set a clear goal of what we want to achieve through AI. And we also want to be we try to be very thorough in the sense of measuring or trying to pinpoint exactly the value that we're creating through these different solutions in many different aspects and in the specific realm of education in terms of what we deliver to teachers and what we deliver to students.
So, AI has been something we've been talking about. It's going to fix higher ed, right? I think probably for about the last 10 years when, I did some Gates Initiative, Gates Foundation work, and then also the Horizon reports have come out. AI is the future. AI is going to enable student support, student success, student learning. So kind of looking back, let's go reverse order. Looking back maybe over the last 5 to 10 years, what have been the successes of AI?
Well, I think that successes with AI start when the application is very, very well defined. So we have a clear goal on what we want to achieve, and we're not trying to build something too sci-fi or too broad that then it becomes diluted or impossible to achieve. From what I've seen from personal experience in working with EdTech projects with AI and from reading about other things that are well established and developed usually go around language, understanding language, mostly chatbots, Q&A bots, trying to offload some of the more repetitive tasks of processes like would be admissions or maybe first-time experiences for students, especially in underdeveloped backgrounds where it may be the first generation that they go they find themselves in a higher education setting and they don't know what to do. And well, normally what they would have done, they would have gone to a counselor or an admin. And given the expansion of higher education in recent years, especially in South America, specifically in Argentina, we have public higher ed, which means that we have a large number of kids that, irrespective of background, they can access the system. But we also see them failing along the way. And one of the reasons, given my experience, I studied in a public university, and as a student, I remember how difficult it was to find answers to many different things, going from where do I fill this form to when is my next exam coming. And I think that automating that repetitive process that takes a lot of time for administrators is one thing. Then there are other things going that are being used more or less widespread, as in terms of trying to do automatic assessments, do some content recommendation, or helping. Okay, well, I haven't seen so much success in terms of learning strategies, which is something we could talk if we say about, okay, what's not really working. But at the very least, helping you sort through a wide variety of content, which nowadays we get more and more content easily available. That would be one thing. And yeah, those are the examples that come to mind. I don't know if the rest can
Well,
weigh
George,
in.
I mean, you're at two different universities, two different countries, and I know you've been doing research on this, and now you've created this global AI network. What's your perspective here on successes and even failures, if you want to chime in there?
Well, I think some of you probably recall there have been companies that have attempted to address this. I mean, you may recall Newton, which I know ASU was also an early adopter, and Smart Sparrow was another one that had that as a bit of an underpinning. So I think the idea of AI was that it would take and make the personalized learning process a reality, and that goes right back to Keller's personalized system of instruction that goes back, 40 years or whatever it is. So that concept hasn't been realized, and so I think just in terms of strictly expectation settings, what we've seen is a lot of statistical modeling, predictive modeling of student success, student failure. You already mentioned a number of things. NLP has had big adoption and continues to have a big impact, and we experience it daily on our phones or if you use voice technology. And so those are certainly the areas of bigger impact. Admission processes have been impactful as well. So when you take that cluster of concepts, you could say AI has done well for the administrative side of the house in some regards. It hasn't done as much for the actual classroom activity. So I'll flip that a little bit and say that we have had the experience of soft AI, which is AI that is a little bit behind the scenes. Learners might not be intentionally aware of it, but it hasn't altered the system of instruction as dramatically as companies like Newton and others said that it would initially. More recently, I think we're starting to see that return to a little bit of that discussion of personalized learning, but so many pieces are missing. So education is a system of systems. And many innovations fail because we don't recognize how the systems interconnect. So if you have a fantastic idea, but it doesn't connect with the student loan system, and it doesn't connect with the accrediting body system, and it doesn't connect with the employer system, it's going to fail. Or at best, you'll kind of hang out in obscurity. So until we make that transition, I think that's why a lot of AI potential has been sort of quashed, because it doesn't connect with the rest of the infrastructure. But the area of sort of the impactful AI, moving away from the administrative side of it, the impactful AI, I think, is going to come in the form of realizing things like building personalized profiles of our students. I mean, in many ways, it's the single biggest unsolved problem in ed tech, and we've been working on this for a number of years. But learning graph, personal learning profiles, that's like a pipe dream still, but we've been thinking about it for 12, 15 years. So I think that part is not yet a reality, and any educator that teaches in a classroom other than maybe a chatbot, maybe a few recommender systems, will have to say AI has by and large failed to make its presence felt in a classroom.
Great. Laurie?
So I'd like to take this opportunity to talk a little bit about recent work that we've been doing with Julie and ASU, and I think we'll count this as an early and exciting version of success. So AI has been, as George was saying, has been used a lot in terms of just kind of predicting, and it's been used fairly well that way, and it's been really, really useful and successful, including in it helping to influence behaviors that might have led to student dropout and things like that. That's to the good. But the exciting piece comes when you start to be able to get a clearer understanding of the data that's available. And start to be able to measure and understand complex education learning phenomena that we say that we care about right now, but we don't know how to measure, so we don't. And so with ASU, who's been really wonderful and open to work with around this question, we've had the chance to start to dig into what does it mean for when students learn how to learn. Can we see that? Can we see that from existing student data? And just very briefly, that phenomenon, we worked together to map that out using an ontology of that phenomenon. What are the component parts? And it has to do with, student self-regulated learning, how do they understand their own learning, how do they regulate it, how do they transfer the process of learning how to learn on an ongoing basis. I mean, it's early doors, but there's some really promising results in being able to see that phenomenon. And what we do know is that it's distinct from how we think about academic achievement right now, how we think about engagement right now. And so this feels like, I'm going to call it a success. It feels a really exciting harbinger of what we can potentially do across education going forward with AI.
I wasn't expecting her to bring our project in, but I'll add to that. Briefly, the charge, from the provost and our dean was really to look across the different modalities and to understand what does each modality do well, where are the weaknesses of each modality, use that understanding to then redesign across all the modalities to improve learning experience and the success of all of our students. And, I think the early indications have been really exciting around, hybrid, of course, I think appeared to perform better than all of the modalities, but online compared to campus, they were equivalent in terms of students being able to develop the ability to learn how to learn. And so I think that's something, important for us, as we're seeing more and more experiences, more and more universities, K through 12 move into that online space. So that's something we're, very excited about, and then taking that data and leveraging it to action to support the faculty in their design process. So thank you for that. Always great to have the promotion. But Katy, what from your perspective? So you're coming very much, I think, from that student success, student support, really focus on students. Where are you seeing the greatest successes in your area?
So I'm going to come back a little bit to what George was talking about around personalized feedback and sort of just-in-time feedback. And I agree that a lot of the promises that were made did not come to fruition. And I think part of that is there was these grand visions of creating personalization in these very complex systems that actually are not very well understood or defined, and the variety of human behavior that you're going to get is very difficult to interpret in some of those models. But where I do think we're seeing some success is in a more granular space, where the set of behaviors and activities is much better defined and easier to sort of document and work against. So I'll give you a couple of examples. There's a math organization product called Gradarius, some of you may know, we've been working with here, and they've been able to, as students are learning math, really understand the individual skills that student is attempting to achieve, many of which might be combined together in a particular problem they're trying to solve. But as the student is solving that problem, they can actually parse if a mistake is made, specifically what skill was it made on, just-in-time intervention and feedback to that student. So it's a pretty narrow use case, but it demonstrates that when you understand the problem set, you really can provide those connections quickly. I was on a panel yesterday with a woman who is doing something similar, using AI to evaluate virtual meetings and the behaviors of individuals in those meetings, and again, provide feedback to that person to say, you dominated the conversation, or the way that you were talking wasn't as convincing or influential in that meeting. So that I think is very interesting, and it's something that we're thinking about in our own product. As Tomas mentioned, this idea that there's these large sets of Q&A, many of these questions are repeat questions, the amount of time that is taken up trying to manage that across the student population. So when a student is coming into our product and asking a question, how can we evaluate that question to a no? This has actually already been answered by somebody in this community, and we can connect you to that solution very quickly. So those are some of the things that I'm really excited about, and I think we're making some progress.
Great. So was that Riff Analytics?
Yes, Riff
and
Analytics,
Beth
now
Porter?
part of ESME Learning.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I've actually demoed that. That was a lot of fun
Yeah.
to get the feedback on how you interact with other people. And so once again, that's something I think we're potentially exploring with our honors college. One of my colleagues is here who's very involved there. So a lot of opportunities. I think that also connects to skills development for our students, understanding how they interact, those soft skills and soft skills development. So Katy, I'm going to come back to you here on how important is the understanding, for the users, how dependent is the success on how well they're using and understanding the AI? How important is that in the implementation and success process?
The individual users of the product?
Correct.
Well, I think it can't be very important if you want it to work, actually, because not everybody's going to grasp it. So I think for us, AI needs to be incorporated subtly and with no cost to the end user. So if you want the end user to be helping train your model, you need to do that in a way that's just a natural extension of their behavior, rather than asking them to do something in addition to help with that process.
So that's somewhat of the black box, right?
Yeah, not to be nefarious necessarily, right? And we would be open to telling people that the AI is a component of the platform. So two things. When our AI is presented in the platform, it has a persona. We call it Rosie, and it has its own profile, and it's obvious that this is not a human being that's talking to you, but a piece of technology. So from that perspective, we're not hiding the fact that AI is a component of what we're doing. But when the person is interacting with that, we don't ask extra of the person in terms of how they interact with that component. It's as if it's a member of the community and you interact with it just as you would anybody else.
Great. So, Laurie, what's your perspective there?
I want to come at it from the perspective of teachers, where I do think it's really important that there's an understanding of AI and knowledge of there. But I don't necessarily mean that from a technical sense. I mean it from a pedagogical sense. So the level of understanding that's important is a basic understanding of what an AI can and can't do, and how that relates to and plugs into what a teacher, whether that be a K-12 teacher or somebody in higher education or in other forms of learning, what they're trying to achieve with their learners. So in that sense, I do think it's critical.
So kind of expanding that question, George, I mean, only maybe a third to half of the audience has ever used AI before in any of the products that they currently use. I mean, is that true? Or are we all using AI and we just don't know that we're using AI? What are your thoughts about that?
I mean, we're all using AI and we're using it all day. And it's shaping where we walk, it's shaping how we drive, it's shaping who we interact with, and it's, your mechanic is using AI in diagnostic activities. So no one in a developed world with a modern digital infrastructure is not using AI. And it's persistent, it's pervasive, it's not a future thing, it's a here thing, it's here today. One of the difficulties that arises around AI in particular, and this is the notion of explainable AI, and there's a growing movement, roots in psychology and computer science, to address, can we test and evaluate a model that we've developed, right? Because often when you get to neural network models where we don't know what they do, we're almost regressing back to Skinner's behaviorism when we look at these systems. They're doing interesting things and generating outputs that we don't know how it got there. We don't know why it weighted those things the way it did and why it produced this result. So we're instead happy it works. Yay, but that's the current outcome. Now, we need to start treating those, and there's a recent paper that targeted exactly this. We need to start treating algorithms or those AI models as cognitive entities that need to be understood the same way that we understood human biological cognition. So for example, we can be talking to someone, we don't know exactly what's happening in their head. We've got, MRI scans that can give us a bit of insight, but almost all of our work in understanding human cognition has come through experimental psychology. So we look at things like response time. We look at things like if you put a map up with someone and you have them look at a map, and up at the top you'll have one area, you have something beside, then you go right down to the bottom. We'll see, and you'll say, okay, now go here, what's that called? And they'll describe it. Now if we then say, what's the one there, use the name, not the location, they'll answer that faster than if we ask them to go down here. So what we're seeing is we're actually traversing that in a very linear kind of a structured way, even though we're just trying to recall it. So our brain thinks spatially in that regard. We gain insights through human cognitive assessment, through experimental design. And I think we're going to need to understand our AI models through the same experimental design. So that's an explainable AI kind of a lens that I think we need to at least pay attention to, because, and we know this, if we don't understand an AI system, we don't understand the biases that it exhibits. We don't understand to whom is that system unfair, because it will likely be unfair to someone. And if we treat it as something that sits behind the scenes, it'll impact us in our daily lives. That introduces a second problem, which is, at some level, I think, AI won't take over humanity so much as humanity will dumb down and structure our processes to meet a structured level of AI. And so we, and that and something I've been arguing for years on, maybe we need to start talking about beingness, like this idea that what we're teaching right now is curriculum. So anything that changes fast isn't technically an economic value point for universities. The things that last long, at least educationally and knowledge-wise, are value points. So certain statistical models, certain concepts of where the world is and what exists here, and those things aren't that consequential, because by the time we teach someone a certain thing, unless there is a developmental aspect that carries over into a new thing, it's not that important to teach specific content. Most of us, the pub conversations of what's the capital of Poland, that you could sit and argue for days in a pub, and now you answer in 2 seconds by checking Google. So I think what I'm trying to articulate with that is if we need to recognize where those AI models intersect with the human system, so that the explainable component is transparent, so we're not caught into a loop of reinforcing bias that puts certain populations on the outskirts. So I think that'd be my primary interest in why explainability is consequential in AI systems.
Okay, so you bring up algorithmic trust, algorithmic bias. Tomas, your company, in essence, helps others make their products powered by artificial intelligence. So how does that engagement work? How do you support them? Do they understand the AI behind the product that you've enabled? And how important is that for the success of that product?
Right. So from our standpoint, we have two kinds of users, right? And what we really expect, or what is actually useful for them to be successful users of AI, varies. So one of them is the students, the actual students, right? And in some cases, it could be argued that they don't really need to understand anything about AI as long as they have something that works. In a case, it could be a bot, and they don't know it's a bot, but if it's delivering something useful and they learn later that it's a bot, you could argue that they could feel deceived. But then again, if it was something really useful, they wouldn't want that taken away, even if you didn't tell them that that was AI powered to begin with. And actually, in some cases, you could argue, like our CTO, Nico Avila, said in a panel yesterday, maybe if you just slap a big powered by AI in front of your solution, people will actually be suspicious and like, I don't know if I want to engage with this. But the other type of users would be, okay, so on the educational institution side, so the teachers, the admins, and they would have to be much more aware of what's going on behind the scenes, not necessarily the technical side of things. But this leads me at one of the biggest roadblocks that we find when approaching a project, which is the data. Data is usually a mess. And sorting through that mess takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a lot of effort usually from people that are not technical, that are on the expertise side of things. The people that are dealing with admissions, people that are dealing with maybe students' mental health, different aspects, are maybe not just related to the classroom, but around the whole educational experience. And sometimes people think, oh, yeah, I just contracted this machine learning as a service, and I'm just going to plug it into my existing LMS, and everything will be fine, and And then things start to fail, and they don't know why. And in my personal experience of dealing with a number of projects, both in and out of EdTech, that making sense of the data is a really significant component in this. So when we approach a project, usually they are at the stage where they think they can do something, but they don't really have that raw material of data. We're not even talking about infrastructure, databases or architecture, whatever, just the raw data. They think they have a lot, and they probably have a lot, but it's in a horrible shape. And making sense of that and sorting through that, it's a time-consuming experience, but it's key, together with having a clear goal, like I said earlier. Those two things are clear, are like key to having a successful project. And sorting through that demands a lot of time and understanding of why this is required, how much effort is required from admin people, from teachers, from support staff, in order to create that solid foundation for a good AI solution, even if it's for a small application.
So a big focus for me is around equity, and we have a commitment to equity in learning and success at ASU. And so I'm going to be vulnerable here for a minute because Katy's one of our best partners. We've been implementing InScribe in many of our courses, and that community learning approach has really helped our students. And like I said, my son has taken a couple of InScribe community classes, and I can actually see it in action. But I've never asked you how the AI worked. I'm sitting here judging myself. And I'm also thinking, I don't know that we've looked at, the potential bias, amongst our students. And is it having the equity that we want it to have? And so I'm not sure if my team's done that with you, or is that something we need to add to the list? But what are your thoughts?
Well, that I think opens up another question, which is assessing whether that bias exists also can be very challenging, right? So like, how do you even go about thinking about that and measuring it? So yes, it's a very important conversation. We should have it. The way our AI works is more about maintaining and monitoring the health of the community right now. But it's not, our AI doesn't work on its own. So our AI is designed to make recommendations and propose interventions that a human then comes in and makes a decision about. So there's that opportunity to gate that bias through the human intervention. That will not always be the case for us, and so making sure that we're keeping track of that, I do agree, is very important and needs to be done in collaboration with the partners that you're working with.
Yeah, I think it's, I think about, our work at ASU. We do use machine learning to understand how students are, the path that they're taking through our different courses, and then really to do predictive analysis. And so one of the things we're very cautious about is making sure that those predictions do no harm and that there's no bias in those predictions. So, this brings us, a few minutes left to our final question. So what does higher education need to do for artificial intelligence to reach its full potential in supporting learning and success and doing no harm with no bias? So who wants to start on that one? George, you're smiling.
Well, first of all, I'll say higher education will not control its AI future. That will come outside of the university. There's no single university globally that has enough technical capabilities, enough data, enough computational power to do AI writ large. That's going to come from some stack of an external technology provider, whether that is a group like 2U or whether that is the existing big tech, Google, Microsoft. Google likely not, Microsoft likely because of their team's environment gives them a trove of data. Canvas is another company that I could see come into that space. So any company that has a roughly full scope view of the student experience in higher education will be the one that will create the AI platforms that are going to drive the future of higher education. Universities often, with a few exceptions, there are universities but often lack the vision in order to realize that capacity. The only counterpoint, if somebody pulls together a university enterprise that has multiple partner collaborations across multiple systems, they share some resources, shared services around data and AI model building, they'll be the ones that have a potential to reach that capacity. But right now, I haven't seen higher education having sustained vision that allows for that kind of collaboration. So that's just to say it will come, but I don't think it'll be ours to own because we don't have the vision for it and we don't have the capacity to work together to do the work at the data that we need to have access to. But what would it look like? I think there's a number of quick points just to mention. So one, we need to do a much better job of mapping the labor market, especially the degree to which universities serve the development of the labor market. And there's a group of companies that are here at this event that do exactly this work. We did a project recently where we scraped the SEEK data to look at what's being hired in different positions, and then we compared it with existing university curriculum, and we created a gap map, which was huge. In some cases, there was only 30% of what was being asked for was actually being taught by that a graduate of that program would learn. So that's one thing, a skills map. Secondly, deep curriculum mapping so that we can start to use non-university centric curriculum that we can bring into that in order to promote and support students. And then thirdly, we need the learner profiles that are persistent, learner-owned across their lifespan, not university-owned, but a profile that they can then go to university and get those gaps met. I think once we get those pieces fit, then the people who own the data, which will likely not be higher education because we don't have it at scale enough to do it, are the ones that'll control AI's future.
Okay, Katy, I saw you jump at the question. What?
Well, I agree. Well, I agree with George that the lack of collaboration in higher ed in some of these areas is holding back the ability of institutions to take a leading role in this process. So I would love to see greater opportunity for collaboration. Whether that's possible or not, I know is a topic for debate. I'll also just speak from a tech provider perspective in this space, which is AI and machine learning and its components are very expensive. They're very hard to do. Most companies do not have the capacity to do that themselves. And so even within the technology space, we look to borrow AI from other places when we can. And so bringing down the cost of that, bringing down the cost of accessing that, and having more opportunity to share algorithms and APIs across tech startups, I think is going to be important for the innovation piece, so that more startups can actually incorporate meaningful and effective AI into their platform, and everyone's not trying to start from scratch all the time.
Are there open source algorithms?
Yes.
There are? And does that work?
There's an interesting project that Microsoft initiated called Open Education, Open Education Analytics. They're doing it at more the K-12 sector, and they've got the typical, GitHub stack, everything set up so people can look at the algorithms, look at the models. We did a paper, I think 12 years ago, called Open Learning Analytics. It's still available online, but I thought we needed a modularized approach with open algorithms that people could see and use, a central algorithm engine that would do the analysis work, and you could just basically click and drag the algorithms that assess. Let's say you want to look at social and emotional learning, and you should be able to activate in your central engine the algorithms that relate to that, assuming, of course, you have, as noted, quality data that allows you to answer those kinds of questions. But yes, there's a pretty rich open source community around it, and interestingly, the OEA work out of Microsoft is open.
Okay, great. So we're coming to the end of our time, but Tomas, looked like you had a quick comment you could make?
Yeah, so essentially we built a number of solutions based around open source solutions that gives you a very rich environment of solutions that you can work with. But what I wanted to say is, going back to a point that George made earlier, I personally think that, well, given that I'm not just on the tech side at Globant, I'm also a university professor myself. What I see so far mostly is like specific successes in specific areas, and like George said, okay, there's some lack of integration. What companies like Globant can bring to the table in that sense, or the other big tech names that were mentioned here, is that ability to integrate across the board, and perhaps a bit of openness towards approaching some problems more holistically, so to speak, in the sense of, okay, well, we may need to bring different areas into the game, make this a little wider. And to finish, one last thing is also openness on our side, because we have to understand that we are coming from Globant, having people that know about ed tech, but we also have to listen to the other end. And like I said before, sorting through that first major roadblock of understanding the problem, understanding the data, needs joint work. So we need to sit together at the table to build solutions together, which is essentially what we do.
Okay, so there's only 15 seconds left. So I'm looking out at all of you. So higher ed, I just heard that we don't collaborate well, and that is a huge limitation to development for supporting the learning and success of our students. So I'm charging all of you, your take home is to get out and collaborate better. And ASU partnerships are how we've gotten to our success. So if you want to collaborate around AI, let me know. And a couple of my colleagues are here up front, so you can also ask them about collaborations as well. So I want to say thanks to this great panel. I appreciate the conversation and the openness. And I think we're good to go. Thank you so much.